Hey friend, let's make a playmat for my daughter's dinosaurs, and maybe in the process we'll discover some cool techniques you can use in your terrain that will also let you roll it up and shove it in a closet. Terrain elevates models, be that wargaming soldiers, model trains, action figures. An environment helps to make the models compelling and more real feeling. That being said, once you create terrain for your models, you've instantly created another problem. Where do you put all this stuff? An acrylic roll-up mat like this one helps to answer that problem by saying, roll it up and chuck it in the closet. As a side benefit of being so flexible, these mats are incredibly durable. Here's what we're going to be looking for out of this craft. Number one, most important, flexibility. If this doesn't roll up without cracking or otherwise damaging or marring the surface of the materials, it's not worth the time to try and put it on there. Number two is durability. It's not going to matter if these things can roll up if in the process of being rolled up the friction of these materials touching each other ends up wearing them off or damaging them in some way. So we're going to be trying to find something that can take the heat of constant manhandling. Number three, real texture. So there's a number of wargaming products that already exist that provide beautiful images on a completely flat mat. What we're looking to do is get rid of that issue where your models float above the mat instead of seeming to interact with it. That little bit of interaction, I think, creates a really compelling effect. Number four, maximum specificity with maximum utility. Okay, so what I mean by this is the more specific you can get your details on your crafts, the more realistic it's going to appear to the eye. That being said, you don't want to create an aesthetic that's going to conflict with the models you want to put on it. For instance, if you put fantasy details on your roll-up mat, now science fiction models are going to have a lot more difficulty getting along with the environment. They're going to look out of place. So what we're going to do is try and get as much detail in there that feels right without specifying exactly what we're going to put on it. In that vein, the more number of play areas you can cram into that mat without it losing the feeling of cohesion and proportion, the more utility it has for storytelling and play. Lastly, one that's kind of personal to me, integration into home environments. I want this to look okay on my rug. Again, this is going to be for my daughter playing with her toys, so I don't want it to feel like there's some scrap of weird stuff on the floor. I want it to look like it's a toy that's supposed to be being used. I think this is going to apply for other contexts as well. If you're using this to set up temporary dioramas for photography, or if we're using this to do wargaming with, you don't want it to look out of place or feel uncomfortable for people who are in the room looking at this object. Let's make a playmat, and I hope you enjoy it. So I tried out two different types of cloth. I tried out a thicker and a thinner muslin. They both work just fine. I've seen some other YouTube videos where they talked about how they had problems with the acrylic caulking bleeding through, but that wasn't my experience. Anything about caulk that isn't awkward. I don't recommend anything other than the most basic DAP, elastomeric. Elastomeric should help with the fact that this is going to be bent so much. Elastomeric just means it's stretchy. But the more expensive, the more fancy the caulking, the harder it seemed to work with. Probably because the more unusual ingredients it was made with were. This video is going to be full of me making ridiculous mistakes. I want to show just the thought process I put into things and obstacles I run into. For example, not realizing that this caulk has a seal protecting it. So I cut the tip off it pointlessly since I pushed it so hard with the caulking gun that its dispenser stopped working. So that's how we end up shaking caulk out of a tube. hot glue ended up sticking forever. So it didn't end up being a very good way of securing the end. Eventually I ended up using duct tape, which is a much better method. Really afraid at first this was going to bleed, so I ended up protecting the surfaces kind of needlessly. The only thing that bled was paint. Finally using the right tool for the job to smooth out the caulk. Crafts unless I was thoughtlessly cutting apart things I've made. Thankfully it ended up all working out and I was able to use all the faux fur cracked earth foam. Note here, you can tell that there isn't actually any caulk on this muslin. That's because I did 2 of these. I tried one without any baseline caulk and one with baseline caulk. I don't recommend doing it just straight onto fabric for a couple of reasons. The weight of the caulk helps it to sit flat instead of wrinkling, and the wrinkles will inevitably show through whatever the material is. So in this middle section, you'll see eventually I start putting some dirt and flocking on it, and it ends up crinkling pretty badly in the end result. It doesn't look too bad because it's supposed to be wasteland with hills and cracks and so on. If you're trying to get a different effect, I recommend putting down a layer of caulking first. Other thing you can see on this is that I've marked out where I plan on having things. Highly recommend that. Ended up being really helpful, made the end result look a lot nicer. This barred cement, it's supposedly very useful. I haven't had a chance to use it because after this, the cement cemented itself shut. The container out when we so just threw it out. And it's enough bad experience to play with it anymore. It needs a non-porous surface, at least a mostly non-porous surface to grab onto. So in this case, I put it straight on the muslin fabric. Why not have just bare fabric to caulk it on first? I applied it to the teddy bear fur, and the bond was on system. So what Barge recommends you do is that you lay down what is essentially a primer coat. You soak it with the cement, you let it dry, and then you soak with cement again, and then you can do the whole wait 5 minutes, push it together, an instant bond thing. Basics. It's super cheap, it's vibrant colored. The only downside it has is that it's so thick. So here I'm just getting my brush soaking wet before I apply it. But look at that blue. You don't see that in craft paint. I really like the way this turned out. The suggestion of ground and silt underneath the water from the brown. Is also not material of choice here. I tried it a second time for a different one of these mats, and it consistently sets up really hard, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but in this particular case where you want it to be flexible, it cracks. Just soak that thing in glue. Something I also like to call out is just how awful things look for a good amount of the crafting process, and I feel like pull together once you work it a bit, but you always got to make it through the ugly phase. again, don't use the fancy materials. At least my experience says not to use the fancy materials. This may be extra durable, clear elastic mirror caulking, but it is impossible to get it to smooth out. Also, you can see here me trying to use it for the water by thinning it with water, since it is a water-based caulk, and the hopelessness of trying to get that stuff to thin. And here's me thinking, maybe I can just wipe it on. Nope, you can't wipe it on. Gorilla Glue construction adhesive is a fantastic product. It can do all sorts of really cool things. One of the things it can do that is cool, you thin it with isopropyl alcohol and it forms a clear, thin, and flexible material. I found out that it's not really thin enough even when you thin it, and so I had to spray isopropyl alcohol over the whole thing, smooth it out. And I also found that for some reason it made these little gross things, little bits of cure, I guess. I can't tell if that's because I didn't clean the pot well enough or if there's some other source of it, but I think in the end, just don't recommend using it to try and do the job that you could have done for much cheaper with just normal clear caulking. Moment of truth, will it roll up? Yes, thank goodness. So much of this project, I proceeded ahead with confidence, knowing that whatever I was doing next could just ruin everything. And so, alternating enormous confidence and enormous anxiety, because, you know, you don't know what's going to mess the whole thing up, and so you can't really stop and be extra cautious or measure things out or be really worried about stuff or you'd be at it for forever. On the other hand, the nicer it looks, the more you work on it, the more you hope that it's going to turn out, and the more nervous you get about this next step ruining it. So this is the clear caulking. It goes on white, but it dries clear. Also, use one of these drywall spreading things. It's much nicer than trying to spread it with a brush. One of the things I'm glad for is this is the last project I've shot with my phone. Don't try and make YouTube videos with your phone, or at least don't make it with an Android. My Pixel would switch randomly between 4K and 2K and no Ks. It would overheat and shut off halfway through a craft, run out of battery even though I was charging it. I ended up liking the effect of this, doing a sort of a edge highlight, using the flat of the brush to catch the raised edges and to make those black so they look like cooling lava that is hardening back into rock. Ah, yes, the toilet paper. So I've had some success with toilet paper in the past to make a waves and water effect. It ends up working a little different here. This is another good example of looks just absolutely terrible until it stops looking terrible. Because look at that. That's how is this going to turn out? Until magically ironically, it starts to look like waves for me. I really liked the way it looked at this point. I kind of regret that I didn't end up putting some white paint in there, because when it dries, big lumps of toilet paper. I am pleased with it though. I thought it looked good. So, what do you think? From a durability and flexibility standpoint, I think it's doing great. This thing has gotten so much abuse over the past few months, and it has been holding up. The only thing that I've seen is the Mod Podge stiffness has made it so that when that area of soil flexes a bunch, it creates these kind of visual lines. It doesn't look terrible because it's supposed to look like rock, and having those irregular lines just kind of fits with the vibe. But something to keep in mind, I wouldn't just leave any areas without acrylic caulking on them. It just makes it so that it's a lot less durable. There are areas of texture where I'm pleased, and areas of texture where I'm a little bit less pleased. I wish I had done the grass a little bit shorter. It looks really good depending on the scale of thing you put on it. So if you get a nice, like, giant dinosaur, it looks pretty good because the grass is coming up over their feet. But if you try and put like a 28mm figure on it, it becomes 6 foot tall grass. So I would advise cutting a little bit shorter if you end up trying to attempt this craft. I was pleased as punch with the way that the cracked earth bends and flexes, and the water continues to look really nice. I could also say, as a parent who's compelled to do a lot of pretend, it is really nice to have something to bounce off of. To have a tar pit for the dinosaurs to get stuck in, and some lava to create some peril where they have to create a bridge or fly over it or whatever. Lends a lot of storytelling just automatically. I hope that would be the same whether you're doing role-playing or wargaming or something else. It provides a lot of drama just based on the terrain features that you've included. I really like the playability of this. Lastly, I do think it looks pretty good in the house. I'm pleased with the way it looks while it's sitting out. It doesn't feel like a weird thing has been left on the floor. It invites you to come over and play with it. It doesn't shatter the illusion that it's sitting right next to a bunch of Duplo blocks, for instance. So yeah, that is it for this really big project. This took me a few months. I think I could go a lot quicker if I was to do it again. And in fact, I actually have whipped up a similar one for some friends that focused more on a desert style environment. I used upholstery foam to make some hyper durable, realistic rocks that give a lot of height that you could still end up squishing down into that rolled up acrylic mat. But that's for another video. Thanks for sticking with me. See you next time.